Welcome back, my friend, to Sleepy Science Nerd, the quiet corner of the internet, where we wander through the universe, one yawn at a time. Whether you've joined me to learn something new, to unwind after a long day, or to let my voice slowly drift you toward sleep, you've made the right turn in the cosmic hallway tonight. Wait, before we jump into this thrilling story, make sure to give this video a like and hit that subscribe button. It really helps me stay motivated to create even better content. Now let's dive into this series and see what it's all about. Thanks you. Tonight, we'll follow a silver ribbon of moonlight across the ocean, tracing it back to the one who's been gently pulling at Earth's waters for billions of years, the moon. It's been doing this for so long and so quietly that most of the time we forget it's even happening. But it's there, constant, patient, and oddly charming for a giant dusty rock. Imagine yourself standing barefoot on a beach just before dawn. The air is cool enough to make you draw your sweater closer, yet the sand under your toes still holds a faint whisper of yesterday's warmth. The horizon wears a faint blush, as if the night left a shy kiss on the morning sky. A soft wind moves past, carrying the scent of salt and something older than time. Waves stretch forward, pause for a heartbeat, and slip back again, the ocean's version of breathing in and out. That rhythm, you see, is the tide, quiet, steady, ancient. But behind this peaceful, almost sleepy scene, there's a planetary ballet unfolding, choreographed by forces so steady and subtle you'd never notice unless someone told you. The dancers Earth, the moon, and yes, even the sun, though the sun tends to show up like a guest star rather than the main act. Now, if you picture the moon yanking the oceans around like a stubborn child dragging a blanket through the house, you're close, but not quite there. It's not a sharp pull. It's more like the moon is whispering, "Come closer," over and over, and the oceans, being very polite, agree to move in, but only a little and only for a while. Here's the basic picture. The moon's gravity pulls on Earth, and because water is more easygoing than solid rock, the oceans respond more noticeably. On the side of Earth that faces the moon, the water swells toward it, forming a bulge. That bulge is what we call high tide number 1. But here's the twist that always makes people frown in a curious way. There's a second bulge on the exact opposite side of the planet. No, the moon doesn't have secret arms stretching around to grab the other side. What's happening is this. The moon pulls hardest on the water closest to it, a little less on Earth's solid body, and the least on the water farthest from it. That far side water lags behind, almost as if it's saying, "You all go ahead without me." The result is another high tide, not from being pulled away, but from being left behind in a slightly different gravitational balance. As Earth spins, different parts of the planet pass through these bulges, moving from low tide into high tide and back again. You might expect this to happen exactly every 12 hours, like clockwork, but the moon is also moving in its orbit around Earth, and it's moving in the same direction we spin. That means we have to catch up to it each day, so the time between high tides is about 12 hours and 25 minutes, not 12 on the dot. In other words, the tide doesn't care about your watch. It keeps moon time. Not every place on Earth experiences the same kind of tidal rhythm. Some places get 2 highs and 2 lows of nearly equal size. Each day we call that semi-diurnal. Others get only one of each diurnal. And in some spots, the tides behave like a jazz musician improvising their heights in ways that are harder to predict. These are mixed tides. The differences depend on the shape of the coastline, the depth of the water, and the underwater landscape. The ocean has moods, and geography sets the stage for them. For thousands of years, people have been watching and recording these patterns. Ancient fishermen along the coasts of China timed their harvests with the turning of the tide. Monks in medieval Europe scheduled their prayers by it. Entire cities have grown where the tides are favorable, and in other cases, whole settlements have been abandoned when the tides decided to rewrite the coastline. The ocean does not negotiate, and even now, with satellites and apps telling us exactly when the tide will turn, the essence of it hasn't changed. The moon pulls and the ocean answers. Somewhere right now in a harbor you've never seen, a fishing boat rests lower in the water because the tide has gone out. Somewhere else, waves are licking higher against a pier as the tide rolls in. And somewhere in the quiet between those movements, a crab is deciding whether it's safe to scuttle out from its hiding place. Standing at the edge of the sea, you're standing inside that rhythm, a cycle that's been repeating since long before humans stood here to notice it. Each wave that touches your feet is part of a slow heartbeat that connects you the ocean and the moon in a way that's both invisible and undeniable. So tonight, as you settle under your blanket, think about this. Even now, while you rest, the moon is turning its pale face toward us, pulling gently at the oceans, and the oceans are answering in their own language. That conversation has never stopped. It has outlasted empires, glaciers, and every restless moment in between, and it will keep going long after we're gone. And maybe if you listen closely enough, past the hum of your thoughts and the quiet of your room, you can almost hear it, the moon calling the ocean, answering again and again in the oldest song the earth knows. If you're still with me, dear listener, here in our quiet corner of Sleepy Science Nerd, then the blankets are probably warm. By now, the room is dim, and the moon is at this very moment keeping watch outside your window. We've followed its gentle pull across beaches, and harbors felt its invisible hand lift and lower the sea. But the moon, for all its influence, isn't dancing alone. There's another partner in this slow waltz one that's been in the picture since the very beginning, the sun. Now the sun's role in tides might surprise you. After all, it's far away, about 93 million miles, give or take the width of a beach towel. And yet, its gravitational pull is strong enough to keep Earth in orbit, which makes our little moon's tug look like a polite suggestion in comparison. But here's the twist. When it comes to tides, the sun's influence is only about half as strong as the moon's. The reason is distance. Gravity gets weaker the farther away you are, and 93 million miles is quite a commute. Still half as strong doesn't mean irrelevant. When the sun decides to team up with the moon, the oceans take notice. This happens twice a month during the new moon and the full moon. Imagine the Earth, the moon, and the sun lined up in space. In astronomy, we call this syzygy, which is both a fun word to say and the kind of Scrabble play that makes your friends suspicious. In these moments, the sun and moon pull together, stretching the tides higher than usual and lowering the lows even further. We call these spring tides not because of the season, but from an old English word meaning to leap. A spring tide isn't subtle. Along certain coasts, the water charges higher up the beach, swallowing sand you walked on just hours earlier. In tidal rivers, currents run faster, as if the ocean has had a double espresso. And in some shallow bays, the retreat of a spring tide leaves boats tilted on their sides, patiently waiting for the water to return. But just as the sun can amplify the moon's work, it can also soften it. This happens when the sun and moon are at right angles relative to Earth, the first and third quarter phases of the moon. Their gravitational pulls partially cancel each other out, producing neap tides. These are the ocean's relaxed days. High tides aren't so high, low tides aren't so low. If spring tides are like the ocean taking a deep breath, neap tides are like a slow sigh. You might think of this pattern, spring neap, as the moon and sun's way of keeping the ocean's mood in balance. Twice a month, they turn up the drama. Twice a month, they tone it down. The cycle is predictable enough that ancient sailors could plan voyages around it, and modern harbors still keep a close eye on it. In Venice, for example, a spring tide coinciding with certain winds can send water spilling into the streets. And in places like the Bay of Fundy, where tides are already dramatic, spring tides are the difference between impressive and jaw-dropping. Speaking of the Bay of Fundy, let's take a quick detour there. Nestled between the Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, this bay holds the record for the highest tidal range on Earth, over 50 feet, from low to high. The secret lies in its shape and timing. The bay acts like a giant bathtub, with the incoming tide sloshing in rhythm with the bay's natural resonance. Each wave arrives just in time to give the water already inside a little boost, piling it higher and higher. During spring tides, the effect is magnified. You could practically watch the shoreline change before your eyes. Half a world away, in France, there's another famous stage for tidal drama, Mont Saint-Michel. This medieval abbey perches on a rocky island off the Normandy coast, connected to the mainland by a causeway. At low tide, you can walk across the sand to reach it, but during a spring tide, the sea rushes in so quickly that locals warn it moves as fast as a galloping horse. Visitors who ignore the tide tables often find themselves stranded or making an unplanned dash back to dry land, shoes and all. Of course, not all places show such extremes. The Mediterranean Sea, for instance, is almost entirely enclosed by land with only a narrow connection to the Atlantic. This bottleneck keeps tidal ranges to a few inches, in most places, small enough that casual visitors might not notice a tide at all. It's as if the ocean here has been asked to keep its voice down. Then there's the Gulf of Mexico, where certain areas see only one high tide and one low tide per day. This diurnal pattern is rare globally, but perfectly normal here, shaped by the basin's size and the way tidal waves enter it. It's a reminder that while the forces behind tides are universal, the way they play out depends entirely on geography. But let's not forget, tides are not just about water levels. They shape ecosystems too. Along coasts with large tidal ranges, intertidal zones, those stretches of land covered at high tide and exposed at low, become some of the most biologically rich habitats on Earth. Crabs' mussels, sea stars, and countless other creatures have learned to live by the moon's schedule. Some even sync their reproductive cycles with the spring tides, timing the release of eggs and larvae to maximize their chances of survival. In Delaware Bay, for example, horseshoe crabs swarm the beaches during May and June, timing their arrival with the highest spring tides. They lay millions of eggs in the wet sand just beyond the usual reach of the waves. These eggs in turn become a crucial food source for migrating shorebirds, a meeting of species coordinated by nothing more than the moon, the sun, and gravity. All of this, from the flooding of a Venetian piazza to the feeding of a sandpiper on a distant shore, happens because of the quiet conversation between celestial bodies. And that's the magic of tides. They're at once predictable and endlessly varied. You could stand on a beach anywhere in the world, and the pattern you'd see would be unique to that place, shaped by local geography, weather, and the timing of the moon's orbit. Yet the underlying rhythm is the same everywhere. Even now, as you lie there listening, the next tide is on its way. Somewhere, a fishing boat is adjusting its ropes. Somewhere else, a mangrove swamp is filling with brackish water, ready to shelter young fish until the tide retreats again. And high above the moon glides silently the sun standing by. And together, they guide this slow, endless pulse. If there's a lesson in all of this, beyond the delightful excuse to say syzygy, it might be that great change doesn't have to be loud. The most powerful forces in the world often work quietly, steadily, without demanding your attention. And whether you're watching the Bay of Fundy roar or the Mediterranean barely stir, you're seeing the same cosmic choreography, one that's been going on for billions of years and will continue long after the last grain of sand has shifted. So let's keep following that rhythm. The moon's story isn't done yet, and neither is ours tonight. Ahead lies the tale of how Earth's own shape, its mountains beneath the waves, its deep ocean trenches, its jagged coastlines, shapes the tides into patterns as unique as fingerprints. But for now, just rest in the knowledge that you live in a planet whose oceans breathe in time with the heavens. And maybe if you listen closely enough, you can hear that breath in the darkness. We've followed the moon and the sun through their patient choreography, tugging at the oceans in a rhythm that's been going on since long before life found its way onto land. But there's another dancer in this performance, one that doesn't shine in the sky or circle above us. This one lies beneath our feet, the earth itself. You might imagine the oceans as one great unified body of water, like an enormous bowl that sloshes evenly when nudged. In truth, they're more like a collection of vast irregular basins, stitched together by straits channels and the occasional deep trench. And these shapes, along with the land that borders them, decide exactly how the moon's pull will play out in any given place. Let's start with the fact that tidal waves are not like the waves that crash on a beach. They're more like massive, slow-moving bulges of water stretching thousands of miles from crest to crest. These bulges travel around the globe, guided by the moon's and sun's pull, and when they meet land, they don't just stop politely. They bend, they reflect, they squeeze through narrow gaps, and each interaction changes their size and timing. Take the Bay of Fundy, which we've already visited in spirit. Its towering tides aren't just because of the moon's pull, they're also the result of perfect timing. The bay's natural sloshing period matches the timing of the incoming tidal wave from the Atlantic. Each wave arrives just in time to boost the water already inside, a process called resonance. It's like pushing a child on a swing. If you push at the right moment, the swing goes higher. Push at the wrong time, and you just look like you're patting the air. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the Mediterranean Sea. Almost entirely enclosed by land, it has only a narrow connection to the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar. That bottleneck keeps tidal bulges from flowing in, freely muting the tides to just a few inches in most places. Here the moon's voice is still speaking, but it's muffled, as though the ocean has been told to keep things down. And then there are the amphidromic points. These are spots in the open ocean where the tide doesn't seem to rise or fall at all. Instead, the tidal wave rotates around them in a great slow circle, like water swirling around the center of a lazy whirlpool. Stand in the middle of one, and you might not notice the tide moving at all, while hundreds of miles away, the water is climbing and falling like clockwork. These points exist because the tidal wave has to twist and turn around continents guided not just by gravity, but by Earth's rotation and something called the Coriolis effect. The Coriolis effect is the same phenomenon that makes hurricanes spin in opposite directions in the northern and southern hemispheres. It also helps give tidal waves their circular paths around amphidromic points. Think of the ocean as a massive rotating record, only instead of music, it's playing the slow beat of the moon's pull. Resonance doesn't just happen in giant bays. It can appear in smaller inlets too. In some places, the timing of the tides matches the natural rhythm of a fjord or estuary so perfectly that the water inside can rise and fall dramatically, even if the open ocean nearby shows only modest change. These places can turn into tidal powerhouses, or for the unwary sailor, tidal traps. The shape of the coastline above water matters too. A gently sloping beach will show a much more dramatic horizontal change between high and low tide than a steep, rocky shore. If you've ever walked on a flat beach and seen the water retreat hundreds of feet during low tide, you've witnessed this effect. In contrast, along a cliff face, the same vertical change in water level might only make the waves climb a little higher up the rocks. Tides can even create currents strong enough to reverse rivers. In the United Kingdom, the Severn estuary is famous for its tidal, bore wave that rushes upstream when the incoming tide pushes against the river's flow. It can stretch for miles, and yes, people surf it. Imagine riding a single wave for more than an hour, gliding past farms and villages, while the river flows backward beneath you. These powerful tidal currents aren't just spectacles. They shape the lives of the creatures that live in them. In intertidal zones, animals and plants have to cope with being alternately submerged in water and exposed to air, sometimes in extremes of heat-cold or salinity. Barnacles cement themselves to rocks, shutting tight when the tide goes out. Mussels cling in clusters, their shells locking together to resist waves. Sea stars patrol during high tide and tuck into crevices during low tide. Even fish adapt to the cycle. Some species time their spawning to coincide with particular tidal phases, using the higher water to reach sheltered breeding grounds. There is a little fish called the grunion, found along the coasts of California and Mexico, that takes tidal timing to a whole new level. During certain spring tides, they ride the waves ashore at night, wriggling onto the beach to lay their eggs in wet sand just beyond the usual reach of the tide. 2 weeks later, when the next spring tide arrives, the eggs hatch and the young fish are swept back out to sea. It's a life cycle choreographed entirely by the moon. Further north in Alaska, you might witness something equally remarkable. Vast mudflats exposed at low tide, covered with clams, worms, and other creatures. As the tide comes in, these flats become a feeding ground for shorebird seals and even brown bears, all arriving with impeccable timing. The tide in these places is less a background condition and more a clock everyone obeys. Even coral reefs feel the rhythm. In some shallow reefs, tides help circulate oxygen-rich water, keeping the ecosystem healthy. During particularly low tides, parts of the reef might be exposed to the air, forcing its inhabitants to hunker down until the water returns. And in mangrove forests, the tides determine which roots are submerged and for how long, affecting everything from the growth of the trees to the nursery habitats of countless fish. It's worth remembering that all of this, from a barnacle clinging to a rock to the vast sweep of a tidal bore, comes from the same force that's pulling at you right now, even as you lie in bed. The moon's gravity doesn't switch off when you stop paying attention. It's always there, steady as a heartbeat, moving oceans, shaping coastlines, and setting the schedules of creatures you'll never see. And if you step back far enough, not physically, unless you have a spare spaceship, you see that the Earth, the moon, and the sun are all part of this system. The shapes of the ocean basins the spin of the planet, the gravitational push and pull between celestial bodies. They all weave together into one vast, intricate pattern. It's a reminder that nothing in the universe exists in isolation. Even the shape of a bay on a map can change the way the moon's pull is expressed on Earth. So next time you stand on a shore and watch the water creeping up or slipping away, think of the geography beneath it, the unseen mountains, valleys, and plains that guide its path. Think of the invisible lines of force stretching from here to the moon and beyond that to the sun. And maybe for just a moment, you'll feel like you're part of that same grand design, because you are. We've talked about the moon's pull, the sun's influence, and the way Earth's own shape sculpts the tides. But like all long relationships, the story between the Earth and moon hasn't stayed exactly the same over time. In fact, the tides we see today are just a snapshot, a single frame in a film that's been running for billions of years. To understand how we got here, we have to go way back. And I mean way back, not just a few centuries, not even a few million years, but all the way to when Earth itself was young, still cooling from its formation. Back then, the moon didn't hang at a polite distance in the sky. It was much closer. Imagine it filling a huge part of the night, so large you could see its craters with the naked eye, no telescope needed. It's almost unsettling to picture like having a very quiet neighbor whose window is suddenly only a few feet from yours. Scientists believe the moon was born out of catastrophe, likely the result of a massive collision between the young Earth and a Mars-sized object named Theia. The debris from this impact eventually coalesced into the moon, which began orbiting Earth at a distance of only about 22,000 kilometers. Today, that distance is about 384,000 kilometers. So yes, the moon has been slowly backing away from us for billions of years at a speed of roughly 3.8 centimeters per year, about the same rate your fingernails grow. When the moon was closer, its gravitational pull on the oceans was far stronger. Tides were enormous, hundreds of feet high in some places, and they rushed in and out with such force that coastlines might have shifted daily. Imagine trying to build a beach house in those conditions. The insurance premiums alone. Earth's rotation was different then too. A day might have been only 5 or 6 hours long. That meant the tide cycled through much faster. Instead of the gentle rise and fall We know now the ocean's surface might have been in a state of near constant motion, like living next to a giant washing machine with no off button. But nature has a way of finding balance. Each time the ocean's tidal bulges rubbed against the seafloor, they created friction. That friction acted like a brake on Earth's spin, slowing the rotation just a tiny bit. The energy lost from Earth's spin didn't disappear. It was transferred to the moon, giving it a small push outward in its orbit. And so, over millions and millions of years, the moon drifted away and our days grew longer. This process is still happening now. If you could fast forward far into the future, hundreds of millions of years, a day on Earth might last 26 or even 28 hours, and the moon would appear slightly smaller in the sky. But don't worry, you won't need to reset your watch anytime soon. In a human lifetime, the difference is so small, it's almost poetic, a slow, unhurried change that's in keeping with the moon's personality. The record of these changes is written in stone, literally. In some parts of the world, ancient tidal patterns have been preserved in layers of sedimentary rock. You can find ripple marks that once formed under shallow water hundreds of millions of years ago, frozen in place as the mud hardened into stone. By counting these layers, scientists can estimate how many tides there were in a year back then, which in turn tells them how long the day was. Some of the oldest records from over 600 million years ago suggest there were about 400 days in a year. That means each day was just over 21 hours long. Coral growth rings, much like tree rings, also tell this story. They show daily patterns of sunlight and feeding locked into the skeletons of creatures that lived and died long before humans. It's like a diary kept by the planet itself, one that requires a lot of patience and a geology degree to read. Of course, the future of tides isn't shaped only by celestial mechanics. Climate change, rising sea levels, and melting glaciers will alter coastlines, changing how and where tides behave. In some places, tides may become stronger, in others weaker. Estuaries could flood islands, could shrink, and new inlets could form, subtly rewriting the choreography between moon and ocean. And yet, for all these changes, the essential rhythm will remain. The moon will keep circling, the oceans will keep answering, and the slow exchange of energy between them will continue. I sometimes think about the sheer number of beings that have watched this same moon dinosaurs in primeval swamps, tiny mammals darting through ferns, early humans gathering on shorelines to watch the tide roll in. None of them could have explained the physics, but all of them felt its pull. That connection is one of the quiet miracles of living on this planet. We're part of a story that's been running since before our species even existed. And there's something oddly comforting about that. In a world where so much feels uncertain, the moon's slow drift and the tide's steady breathing remind us that some things change only in the gentlest possible way. It's like knowing a dear friend will always be there, perhaps standing a little farther away as the centuries pass, but never out of sight. If you're still awake, and honestly, no judgment. If you're not, picture it now, the moon overhead, pale and familiar, quietly pulling at the oceans leaning in and then letting go, again and again. Somewhere, a beach is being uncovered. Somewhere else, water is creeping up over a rocky shore. And all of it is part of a conversation that began in the chaos of planetary birth and will continue until the last day the moon circles us. And if you find yourself by the sea tomorrow, maybe you'll see it a little differently, not just as waves on a shore, but as the visible edge of an ancient partnership, one that's been shaping the world for billions of years and shaping us too. The moon may move the oceans, but the tides move life. Nowhere is that more obvious than in the narrow, shifting strip where land meets sea, the intertidal zone. It's a place of dual identities, half land, half ocean, and constantly switching between the two. Twice a day, it changes entirely, reshaping itself as if it can't decide which world it belongs to. If you've ever walked along a shore at low tide, you've probably seen hints of this world. Tide pools shimmering in the sunstrands of seaweed draped across rocks like nature's streamers, crabs scuttling into shadow as your footsteps approach. To the creatures that live here, the tides are more than background noise. They're the clock, the calendar, the rhythm that everything else is built around. Take the humble sea star. From our perspective, it might look like it's just sitting there, blending in with the rocks, but it's actually a slow motion hunter. When the tide comes in, it moves out to feed prying open muscles with a hydraulic grip that would put most gym goers to shame. When the water retreats, it settles into crevices, clinging tight until the next flood. Or consider the periwinkle snail, a small, unassuming resident of rocky shores. At low tide, it tucks itself away, sealing its shell to keep from drying out. As the tide returns, it ventures out grazing on microscopic algae. To us, it's barely noticeable. To the snail, the tide is everything. And then there's the grunion, a fish that takes its devotion to the tide to a whole new level. Found along the coasts of California and Mexico, grunions spawn only on certain nights of the year during the highest spring tides. When the timing is right, they ride the waves ashore, wriggling onto the beach to lay their eggs in the wet sand just beyond the reach of the usual tide. 2 weeks later, when the next spring tide arrives, the eggs hatch and the young fish are swept out to sea in a silver shimmer. It's a life cycle that depends entirely on the moon's schedule. The horseshoe crab tells a similar story, though, on a grander scale. These ancient creatures' survivors from a time before dinosaurs gather in huge numbers on the beaches of the U.S. Atlantic coast each spring. They time their spawning to the full and new moons when tides run highest. As they deposit millions of eggs in the sand, migrating birds, like the red knot, arrive in perfect synchrony, feasting on the nutrient-rich bounty before continuing on their journeys. It's a meeting of world's ocean shore and sky made possible by the turning of the tide. Tides also act as nature's conveyor belts, carrying nutrients in and out of estuaries and salt marshes. As the water floods in, it brings microscopic plankton and minerals from the open ocean. As it drains away, it carries organic material from the shore back out to sea. These constant exchanges make tidal zones some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth, feeding everything from tiny invertebrates to massive schools of fish. Salt marshes, with their tall grasses swaying in the wind, thrive in this rhythm. They absorb the salty water without harm, anchoring the soil and providing shelter for countless species. Without tides to flush and feed them, these marshes would wither, and the coastlines they protect would be far more vulnerable to erosion and storms. Mangroves, too, depend on the tide. These bristly, salt-loving trees grow in tangled forests along tropical coasts, their roots reaching into brackish water. At high tide, their roots shelter young fish and crabs. At low tide, the same roots stand exposed like a patient army, waiting for the next wave. Even coral reefs feel the pull. In shallow waters, tides bring oxygenated water to the reef, refreshing the ecosystem. During low tides, some reef flats are exposed, forcing fish and invertebrates to take refuge in deeper pools. For creatures like sea cucumbers and clams, the changing water level can trigger feeding or reproduction. Humans, of course, have always been drawn to these tidal edges. Ancient coastal communities built fish traps in the intertidal zone, arranging stones to create pools that would fill at high tide and trap fish as the water receded. Some of these traps, like those in the Orkney Islands of Scotland, are still visible today, worn but not erased by centuries of waves. In parts of northern Europe, where mudflats stretch for miles, people have long timed their travel to the tides walking or driving across the exposed seafloor during low tide to reach islands that vanish beneath the water a few hours later. It's a surreal sight, cars driving across what looks like open ocean, only for the road to disappear. In Southeast Asia, tidal rhythms still shape daily life in fishing villages. Boat trips, net setting, and shoreline foraging all depend on knowing when the tide will rise and fall. In some places, families collect shellfish at low tide, moving quickly before the water returns. The tide isn't just a natural phenomenon here, it's the community's timetable. Tides can even influence human emotion and art. Poets have long used the ebb and flow as a metaphor for love, fortune, and time itself. The turning tide has been painted as both an inevitable change and a chance for renewal. There's something deeply human in watching the water retreat and knowing it will always return. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about tides, their constancy. They've been shaping coastlines and feeding ecosystems for billions of years without ever missing a beat. They don't need our attention to keep going, but when we do stop to notice, we find they're connected to far more than just the rise and fall of the sea. They're woven into the lives of creatures great and small, into the cultures of people who live by the shore, and into the way we think about change and return. So as you drift deeper into the quiet of the night, imagine the tide still moving, somewhere creeping up a sandy beach, swirling into a mangrove forest, rushing over a reef. Imagine the moon, pale and calm, still sending its invitation across space. And imagine the ocean answering as it always has, in a language as old as Earth itself. By now, we've wandered through the moon's pull the sun's backup role, the Earth's shape, and the tidal heartbeat of ecosystems. But the tides aren't just a background rhythm, they're also a force humans have learned to harness. For thousands of years, we've looked at the rise and fall of the sea and wondered, could we turn that motion into something useful? The answer is yes, and in some places, we've been doing it for longer than you might think. The earliest tidal power systems were simple, clever, and built long before anyone thought about renewable energy targets or carbon footprints. Along certain coasts in Europe and the Middle East, communities built tidal mills. At high tide, the sea would flood a basin or pond through a one-way gate. As the tide retreated, the stored water would be released through a water wheel, grinding grain into flour. It was a reliable, predictable source of power, and it didn't depend on the wind blowing or the sun shining. One of the oldest known examples still exists in Northern Ireland at the Nendra Monastery. Dating back to the 7th century, it used nothing more than the moon's schedule and a bit of engineering to keep the monks' kitchens supplied with flour. It's oddly comforting to imagine quiet stone buildings, the tide coming in and going out, and somewhere in between, the steady creak of a mill turning. Fast forward to today, and the basic idea hasn't changed much, though the technology has. Modern tidal power comes in a few main forms. The first is the tidal barrage. Imagine a dam stretched across the mouth of a tidal estuary. As the tide comes in, water builds up behind it. When the tide turns, that water is released through turbines generating electricity. It's essentially hydropower, but with the added twist that the river is actually the ocean moving in two directions. One of the most famous examples is the Rance Tidal Power Station in Brittany, France. Built in 1966, it's still running today, producing enough electricity to power about 130,000 homes. And it does this quietly rain or shine day or night because the moon doesn't take holidays. Another approach is tidal stream generation. Instead of blocking water with a dam, this method places turbines directly in fast-moving tidal currents. Think of them as underwater wind turbines. Because water is so much denser than air, even a relatively slow current can turn the blades with impressive force. These devices can be anchored to the sea floor or even floated in the water column, capturing energy from both the incoming and outgoing tides. There's also the concept of tidal lagoons, artificial enclosures built along coastlines. Water flows in and out through turbines, much like with a barrage, but lagoons can be built where a dam across an entire estuary wouldn't be practical. Advocates say they could generate clean energy while also serving as coastal defenses and even tourist attractions. Of course, the ocean is not an easy landlord. Saltwater corrodes metal, strong currents test every bolt and weld, and storms can tear at even the most carefully designed structures. Maintenance can be costly, and construction is never simple. Not every coastline has the right conditions for tidal power. You need strong tidal ranges or fast currents to make it worthwhile. That's why the technology is still relatively rare compared to wind or solar, and there are environmental questions to consider. Barrages can affect the movement of fish, the flow of sediment, and the delicate balance of estuarine ecosystems. Even underwater turbines, while less intrusive, have to be designed to avoid harming marine life. Engineers and scientists work to minimize these impacts, but the trade-offs are always part of the discussion. Still, the appeal of tidal power is undeniable. Unlike wind or solar, we can predict tides centuries in advance. The moon's pull doesn't fluctuate with the weather, and there's no such thing as a tide drought. This reliability makes tidal energy an attractive piece of the renewable puzzle, especially for coastal communities looking for steady, local sources of power. In some ways, harnessing the tides is humanity's quietest partnership with the moon. We're not just watching the water move, we're working with it, turning that ancient patient motion into something that powers our lights, charges our phones, and runs our trains. It's humbling to think that a journey that began with monks grinding grain could one day lead to cities running on the same principle. And while large-scale tidal power is still developing, smaller tidal projects already supply clean energy to remote villages, research stations, and islands. In places where bringing in fuel is expensive and difficult, the steady push and pull of the ocean is a gift. But even without turbines and dams, the tides have always been a kind of energy for people, not just electrical, but emotional. Fishermen read them to decide when to set sail. Surfers watch them for the perfect break. Coastal farmers depend on them to flood and nourish salt marshes. For anyone who lives close to the sea, the tide is part of the fabric of daily life. And maybe that's the deeper truth about our relationship with the tides. We can measure them, predict them, even harness them, but we're still, in the end, living by their rhythm. The moon pulls the ocean answers, and we follow, sometimes on purpose, sometimes without even noticing. So tonight, as you rest, imagine the invisible hands of gravity still at work. Somewhere, water is rushing through a tidal turbine, turning blades that hum quietly beneath the waves. Somewhere else, the tide is filling a centuries-old mill pond, just as it has for generations. And above it all, the moon keeps its steady watch, never hurrying, never stopping. It's a reminder that progress doesn't always mean replacing the old with the new. Sometimes it means finding the thread that connects them from stone mills to steel turbines, from monastic kitchens to modern power grids, and letting it run forward into the future. The tide doesn't change its nature for us. We adapt to it, and in doing so, we discover new ways to live alongside it. Each night, as the moon rises and casts its silver light over the world, the ocean begins its slow, deliberate shift. It doesn't roar or blaze, it simply moves. This movement, gentle yet powerful, is one of the oldest conversations happening on Earth. But as quiet as it seems, it shapes more than just the water. It influences the very way our planet works. Tides aren't only about the sea creeping up and down a beach. They also play a part in balancing Earth's climate and stirring its oceans from the surface to the deepest depths. Without them, parts of the ocean might grow still and stagnant, and the planet would be a colder, less dynamic place. Here's why, as tides move in and out, they help mix the layers of the ocean. Warm water from the surface and cold water from the depths are constantly being stirred together. This mixing moves heat around the globe and keeps nutrients circulating, nutrients that feed plankton, which feed fish, which feed nearly everything else in the sea. You could say the moon is the quiet chef of the ocean, stirring the soup without anyone noticing. Some ocean currents even rely on tidal forces to keep moving. While wind and differences in temperature drive the largest currents, tides can boost or slow them, nudging vast amounts of water along coastlines and through narrow straits. In certain regions, this tidal push is what keeps local climates mild enough for life to thrive. And tides don't stop at the shoreline. They also affect the solid earth itself. Yes, the ground beneath you rises and falls a few centimeters every day under the pull of the moon and the sun. This earth tide isn't something you feel unless you have extremely sensitive instruments, but it's a reminder that nothing on our planet is truly fixed. Even mountains sway, if only a little. The moon's influence also reaches into the behavior of countless species. We've talked about fish and crabs timing their reproduction with the tides, but the list is much longer. Sea turtles, for example, often hatch at night during particular phases of the tide. The higher water helps young turtles avoid some predators as they scramble toward the sea. Certain corals release their eggs and sperm into the water all at once during a full moon, creating underwater blizzards of life. Even on land, some animals respond to the moon and tides. Shorebirds feed and rest according to when the mudflats are exposed. In the Arctic, reindeer are thought to adjust their migration patterns in part by the moon's light, and the timing of coastal tides which affect the sea ice. It's as if the moon has written its schedule into the DNA of countless creatures. Humans, too, have been influenced by the moon's rhythm in subtle ways. Before artificial lighting, coastal communities lived more closely to the lunar cycle. A full moon and a high tide could make night fishing possible. A low tide at dawn could mean an early trip to gather shellfish. In many cultures, festivals and traditions still follow the lunar calendar, tying human celebration to the pull of the moon. Some researchers have even looked into whether the moon and tides affect human sleep and mood. The evidence is mixed. You probably can't blame a rough night entirely on the full moon, but the idea is tempting. After all, if the moon can move trillions of tons of water, who's to say it can't nudge us a little too? But perhaps the most fascinating part of the tide story is how it's shaped the Earth-Moon relationship itself. Every time the tides bulge and Earth's rotation slows just a fraction, a tiny bit of momentum is transferred to the moon, pushing it farther away. It's like a slow-motion dance, where one partner keeps stepping back millimeter by millimeter. In return, Earth's spin gets a little longer. Billions of years from now, if nothing else changes, the two will be tidally locked, meaning Earth will always show the same face to the moon, just as the moon already always shows the same face to us. By then, the tides will be weaker, the moon will be smaller in our sky, and the days will be longer. But for now, we live in what might be called the golden age of tides, strong enough to shape life, and coastlines regular enough to rely on, and close enough that the moon still looks breathtaking when it rises. And it's that mix of reliability and beauty that makes the tides so remarkable. They're a constant in a world that's always changing. Storms may come and go, rivers may change, coarse empires may rise and fall, but the tide keeps its schedule. Twice a day, everywhere it can, the ocean leans in toward the moon and then slips away again. If you were to stand at the edge of the sea and really pay attention, not just for a few minutes, but for hours, you'd see the shoreline subtly transform. Rocks that were underwater in the morning might be dry by afternoon. Patches of sand might vanish beneath the waves and reappear later as if nothing happened. The change is slow, so gentle you might miss it if you don't watch carefully. And yet, over time, this slow rhythm can carve cliffs, build sandbars, and shift entire coastlines. In some places, you can even hear the tide coming. In the Bay of Fundy, as the water races and it makes a deep rushing sound that echoes off the cliffs. In narrow inlets, the incoming tide can sound like a distant roar, growing louder as the water approaches. Elsewhere, it's almost silent, a whispering edge that creeps forward without fanfare. No matter where you are, the tide is a reminder that we're connected to something bigger than ourselves. It's not just a local event, it's part of a planetary scale interaction that links the ground beneath your feet to the moon high above. And that connection is always there, whether you're watching it or not. So as you lie here now, maybe you can imagine it, the moon above the ocean below, and between them, a thread of invisible force, pulling, releasing, pulling again. That thread runs through every bay, every estuary, every stretch of open sea. It runs through the lives of fish and birds, through the history of human settlement, through the quiet pulse of the earth itself. It's a thread that has been in place since before there were eyes to see the moon or hands to write about it, and it will still be there long after we've stopped telling this story. For now, though, we're lucky enough to live in a time when we can both measure it with science and marvel at it with wonder, and perhaps even fall asleep to the thought of it moving always beneath the surface of the world. If the moon is the headliner of the tidal show, the sun is the special guest star with a voice so powerful it can change the mood of the entire performance. We've already seen how the sun can join forces with the moon during spring tides or work against it during neap tides. But there's more to this duet than just timing. The sun can also add drama in ways that surprise even seasoned tide watchers. First, it helps to remember just how enormous the sun is. It's about 27 million times more massive than the moon. If the sun were an orchestra, the moon would be the single violinist playing quietly in the corner. And yet, in the realm of tides, that quiet violin often takes the lead because the sun is so far away, about 93 million miles. Distance weakens gravity, and the sun's tidal influence ends up being only about half as strong as the moon's. But when the two align, that's when the show really takes off. During a new moon, both the sun and moon pull from the same side, stacking their gravitational influence and creating higher than normal high tides and lower than normal lows. During a full moon, they pull from opposite sides of Earth, still working together in a kind of cosmic tug of war. In both cases, the result is a spring tide where the range between high and low is at its greatest. Spring tides can be breathtaking and in some places a little intimidating. In tidal rivers, currents run faster and stronger. Along certain coasts, water climbs high enough to flood areas that are usually dry. In shallow bays, the retreat of a spring tide can leave fishing boats stranded like toys on wet sand, waiting for the sea to come back. And then there are king tides, the most extreme of the spring tides. These happen when a spring tide coincides with the moon being at perigee, its closest point to Earth. The extra pull makes everything just a little more dramatic. Add in certain weather conditions, and you can get flooding in places that are rarely touched by the sea. Coastal cities from San Francisco to Sydney keep a close eye on these events, knowing they can bring both beauty and trouble. On the other end of the spectrum are neap tides, when the moon is at its first or third quarter, and the sun's pull partially cancels the moon's. These tides are more subdued, the highs aren't so high, and the lows aren't so low. Neap tides are like the intermission in the tidal performance, a time when the ocean catches its breath before the next act. But here's something that might surprise you. The sun's role in tides isn't entirely limited to these monthly rhythms. Seasonal changes in Earth's distance from the sun also play a role. Earth's orbit is slightly elliptical, which means we're closer to the sun in early January and farther away in early July. When we're closer, the sun's gravitational pull is a bit stronger, and tides, especially spring tides, can be slightly larger. It's a subtle effect, but it's there, woven into the fabric of the tidal calendar. And speaking of calendars, people have been keeping track of these patterns for a very long time. Ancient mariners knew that certain times of the month brought stronger tides, even if they didn't know why. Farmers near coastal estuaries planted and harvested with the neap and spring cycles. In some places, festivals still line up with the lunar phases that bring the biggest tides, a celebration of the ocean's heartbeat. One of my favorite examples is in Normandy, France, where the great abbey of Mont Saint-Michel sits on a rocky island. At high spring tide, the sea surrounds it, completely turning it into a fairy tale fortress. At low tide, you can walk across the sand to reach it. The difference is so dramatic that it has inspired legends for centuries and stranded more than a few visitors who didn't check the tide tables. Far across the world, in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, some of the most powerful tides on Earth race through narrow gaps in the cliffs, creating what locals call the horizontal falls. When the tide turns, water surges through with such force that it forms standing waves and whirlpools. It's the ocean showing just how much muscle it can flex when geography and gravity align. In contrast, the Mediterranean Sea offers almost the opposite experience. Its narrow connection to the Atlantic at the Strait of Gibraltar limits how much tidal energy can flow in. The result is a range of just a few inches, in most places barely noticeable unless you're really paying attention. Here the moon and sun still pull, but the sea responds with a polite nod instead of a leap. All of these variations, the surging Bay of Fundy, the quiet Mediterranean, the tidal rivers and flat estuaries, are shaped by the interplay between the moon, the sun, and the Earth's geography. It's a three-body conversation, and the tone changes constantly. And while we've gotten very good at predicting these changes to the point where tide charts can be calculated years or even centuries in advance, there's still something magical about standing on a shore and watching the water rise or fall exactly when it's supposed to. It's like seeing a cosmic promise kept over and over again. For me, that's the real charm of understanding tides. The science is fascinating. Yes, gravitational forces, orbital mechanics, fluid dynamics, but the experience is universal. Whether you're watching the tide creep up a beach, rush through a narrow pass, or barely shift a calm harbor, you're seeing the same dance that connects every coastline on Earth. And the sun, for all its distance, plays its part with quiet confidence. It doesn't need to be the star of the show, though technically it is in every sense of the word. It just keeps shining, pulling gently, and letting the moon take the spotlight most of the time. As you rest tonight, imagine the vast sweep of this system, the moon gliding overhead, the sun's pull, joining in the oceans, answering in countless different ways. Somewhere, a king tide is spilling over a seawall. Somewhere else, a neap tide is leaving boats floating higher than expected in their berths. And all of it is part of the same pattern, repeating endlessly, as steady as the turning of the earth. Tomorrow, the tide will change, again right on schedule, and the day after that, and the day after that. In a world full of unpredictability, that's a comfort worth holding on to. If Earth were a perfect sphere, covered entirely by water, the tides would be a neat, predictable pattern, 2 high tides and 2 low tides each lunar day, almost identical everywhere. But our planet, for all its beauty, is anything but perfect in shape. It's a little squashed at the poles, bulged at the equator, and covered with continents, islands, trenches, and underwater mountains. And that, dear listener, is why the tides are wonderfully complicated. The ocean basins themselves act like enormous containers of water, and the way tidal waves move through them is shaped by the size, depth, and contours of those containers. In some places, the incoming tidal wave from the deep ocean gets squeezed through a narrow opening, speeding up and rising higher. In others, the shape of the coastline causes the tide to be muted, spreading the energy thin. One of the most dramatic examples of this amplification is still the Bay of Fundy in Canada. Its long, narrow shape acts like a funnel forcing the incoming tidal wave into a smaller space. The natural rhythm of the bay's water matches the timing of the Atlantic's tide so perfectly that each incoming wave stacks on top of the last one, creating the highest tidal range on Earth, over 50 feet. It's like the ocean found its favorite drum and just keeps hitting the perfect beat. On the opposite end, you have nearly enclosed seas like the Mediterranean. Because it's connected to the Atlantic only through the narrow Strait of Gibraltar, the amount of tidal energy that can flow in is limited. As a result, the tidal range is only a few inches in many places. Here, the moon's pull is still happening, but the sea is like a polite guest, acknowledging the invitation without making a big scene. And then there are the amphidromic points, mysterious places in the open ocean where the tide hardly seems to move at all. Around these points, the tidal wave rotates in a slow circle, with the highest range far away and the lowest range often close to zero at the center. These aren't stationary spots. In the sense of a physical marker, you could sail right over one without noticing. But they're a fascinating reminder that tides aren't just about water going up and down. They're part of a global system of moving energy. This system is also influenced by Earth's rotation, which brings us to the Coriolis effect. It's the same force that makes hurricanes spin in opposite directions in the northern and southern hemispheres. For tides, the Coriolis effect gives a gentle twist to the movement of water, helping to create those circular patterns around amphidromic points. Imagine the whole ocean as a massive spinning record, with tidal waves tracing graceful loops instead of straight lines. In some coastal regions, resonance plays a starring role. Just as a swing goes higher if you push it at the right moment, a bay or inlet can experience much larger tides if its natural sloshing period matches the timing of the incoming tidal wave. This is why certain places see tides that are wildly different from the open ocean right outside. The slope of the land also matters. A gently sloping beach can show a dramatic horizontal change between high and low tide, with the water retreating hundreds of feet during the ebb. On a steep rocky shore, the same vertical change might be barely noticeable. If you've ever walked far out on a flat beach at low tide and turned back to see the shore in the distance, you felt the scale of this difference. In some rivers, tides create something truly spectacular: tidal bores. These are waves that travel upstream against the current when the incoming tide is strong enough to push into the river mouth. One famous example is on the River Severn in the UK, where surfers ride the bore for miles. Imagine a single wave carrying you past towns and farmland, all powered by the moon's pull. And tides also have the power to reverse the flow of water entirely. In certain estuaries, the direction of the current flips every 6 hours as the tide shifts from flooding in to draining out. For the animals that live here, from fish to crabs to tiny plankton, life is a constant cycle of adapting to whichever way the water is moving. These ever-changing conditions create incredibly rich ecosystems. Intertidal zones, those strips of land alternately covered and exposed by the tide, are home to species that have mastered the art of survival in two worlds. Barnacles glue themselves to rocks and shut tight when the tide leaves them high and dry. Mussels form dense beds, their byssal threads holding them fast against the waves. Sea anemones close up into tight balls until the water returns, then open like flowers to feed. In places with huge tidal ranges, these ecosystems expand dramatically during low tide, revealing a temporary landscape that feels like another planet. Mudflats, tide pools, and exposed reefs teem with life, a living buffet for shorebirds, fish, and mammals. And then, within hours, it's all underwater again. Even the hidden parts of the ocean floor, the mountains, valleys, and plateaus we can't see, play a role in shaping the tides. Underwater ridges can block or redirect tidal waves, while deep trenches can slow them down. In some cases, the interaction between the tide and the seafloor creates standing waves, not in the surface water, but in the deep layers of the ocean. These internal tides move more slowly than the surface tide, but carry enormous amounts of energy, helping to mix the ocean's layers and keep it healthy. It's humbling to think that all of this, the rivers that reverse the bays, that roar, the hidden waves, deep underwater, comes from the same gentle force we feel when a wave laps at our feet. The moon pulls, and the whole planet responds, each place in its own way. If you stand on a beach and watch the tide come in, it might seem like a simple thing, but what you're really seeing is the end of a long, complex journey, a pulse that's traveled across thousands of miles, shaped by the contours of the earth, nudged by the sun, twisted by the planet's spin, and amplified or muted by the lay of the land. By the time it reaches you, it's been through a process as intricate as any piece of music, and that's why no two coasts are quite the same. The moon may play the same tune everywhere, but the Earth's geography changes the arrangement. It's a reminder that even when the rules of physics are universal, the results can be beautifully local. So tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, picture the world's coastlines jagged, curved, smooth, steep, each one catching the tide in its own way. Somewhere, a tidal bore is racing up a river, carrying a surfer into the countryside. Somewhere else, the water is inching across a flat beach, reclaiming ground it surrendered only hours ago. And high above, the moon is still watching, still pulling still, keeping the beat for this endless, intricate dance. The moon has always been our loyal companion, circling us in silence, glowing with borrowed sunlight, and tugging at our oceans like a patient choreographer guiding a massive, watery performance. But just like any long relationship, it hasn't always been the same. The Earth and moon have changed each other over time, and the tides we see now are very different from the ones that washed over our planet billions of years ago. To picture the early Earth-moon relationship, you have to imagine a sky where the moon loomed far larger than it does today, close enough that you might have felt it was leaning in to listen. Scientists believe that in its infancy, the moon was about 22,000 kilometers away, compared to today's comfortable 384,000. That's close enough to make today's supermoon look modest. This closeness wasn't just for show. It meant the tides were colossal. The gravitational pull was so much stronger that the ocean bulges were towering, and they swept across coastlines with incredible force. Back then, the oceans might have been more like restless giants than the calm, breathing waters we see now. Coastlines could have shifted from day to day, shaped by waves hundreds of feet high. And then there was the matter of time, literally. The young Earth spun much faster, completing a rotation in perhaps 5 or 6 hours. That meant more tides per day, each one enormous, each one reshaping the land. The combination of a short day and a close moon made the early tides fierce, almost unrecognizable compared to what we know now. But tides have a way of reshaping not only the land, but also the relationship between Earth and Moon. Every time the oceans bulge and Earth spins beneath them, friction between the moving water and the ocean floor robs our planet of a tiny bit of rotational energy. That energy doesn't just vanish, it's transferred to the Moon, nudging it slightly farther away in its orbit. The result is that Earth's rotation slows down, while the Moon drifts outward, little by little, year after year. Today, the Moon moves away from us at about 3.8 centimeters per year, the same rate your fingernails grow. Over millions of years, that's enough to make a difference. A few 100 million years ago, a day on Earth was about 22 hours long. A few 100 million years from now, it might stretch to 26 or 28 hours. And the tides will be weaker than the Moon, a little smaller in the sky, its grip on the oceans slightly looser. This slow change is recorded in stone, literally. In certain places, ancient tidal patterns are preserved in layers of rock like a planetary diary, written in mud and silt. Fossilized ripple marks show how often the tide came in, and their spacing reveals the length of a day at the time they formed. Coral growth rings tell a similar story, daily patterns etched into the skeletons of creatures that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. These records tell us that the Earth-Moon dance has always been one of give and take. The Moon stabilizes Earth's tilt, keeping our seasons regular. Earth's rotation gives the Moon a slow push outward. The tides are the physical handshake, between them a constant exchange of energy that has been happening since the Moon was born from a massive impact in the chaotic youth of the solar system. And while the geological timescale makes these changes feel impossibly slow, they are happening even now. The Moon's pull is still shaping the way Earth spins, still influencing the length of our days, still adjusting its own orbit ever so slightly. Of course, the tide's future will also be shaped by forces closer to home and much faster moving. Rising sea levels, melting ice sheets, and changing coastlines will alter the way tides behave long before the Moon's slow drift has a noticeable effect. In some places, higher sea levels will make storm surges and king tides more dangerous. In others, shifting shorelines might create new tidal patterns altogether. But even in a changing world, the basic rhythm will endure. Twice a day, everywhere, the ocean touches the land, the tide will come in and go out. The Moon will still rise and fall in our sky, still pulling gently at the waters. And somewhere, on a sandy beach in a quiet marsh in the deep shadow of a fjord, life will still be moving to its ancient schedule. I like to think about how many different beings have lived under this same moon. Dinosaurs watching it rise over primeval swamps, early mammals scurrying under its light, our human ancestors standing on unfamiliar shores, learning to read the tide by the position of the moon. None of them could have described tidal forces or orbital mechanics, but they all felt its pull in some way. And here we are, still watching, still feeling it. We've learned the equations, drawn the diagrams, plotted the charts, but when the moon lifts the ocean and lets it fall again, it still feels like something more than just physics. It feels like being part of a story much older than ourselves. So as you lie there tonight, picture the moon, not just as it is now, but as it once was, closer, brighter, pulling harder, and as it will be in the far future, smaller, more distant, but still linked to us by an unbroken thread of gravity. That thread runs through every tide that has ever been, every tide that will ever be, tying past, present, and future together in a single, endless motion. And if that doesn't make you feel both very small and very connected all at once, I don't know what will. When the tide rolls in, it doesn't just bring seawater. It brings life. It carries tiny drifting organisms, nutrients, and the subtle signals that trigger entire ecosystems into action. For many species, the rise and fall of the ocean is not just a backdrop. It's the metronome that keeps time for everything they do. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the intertidal zone, the constantly shifting strip between land and sea. Twice a day, it transforms entirely from underwater forest to sunlit meadow, from fish-filled shallows to rocky terrain. The creatures that live here are masters of adaptation, and they've evolved to match their schedules to the moon's quiet pull. Barnacles, for example, might not look like much, but they're among the tide's most loyal followers. At high tide, they open their feathery appendages to filter food from the water. At low tide, they clamp shut, sealing in moisture until the next wave returns. It's a simple rhythm, but it has been in place for millions of years. Mussels take a different approach. They gather in dense clusters, their shells bound together by strong threads that keep them from being swept away. When the tide is in, they open slightly to feed. When it's out, they rely on their numbers and their tightly closed shells to keep from drying out in the sun. Sea stars patrol these mussel beds like patient hunters and waiting for the tide to return so they can move in for the slow motion attack. With hydraulic precision, they pry open shells, turning what looks like a quiet tide pool into a very slow drama of predator and prey. In tropical waters, mangrove forests live and breathe by the tide. Their tangled roots act as both shelter and nursery, protecting young fish and crustaceans when the water is high. At low tide, the roots stand exposed, their lower portions coated with shells and sponges. The mangroves themselves are adapted to handle the salty water, thriving in conditions that would kill most plants. Without the tides to flush their roots and bring fresh nutrients, these forests would wither, and with them, the countless species that depend on them. Salt marshes, too, are shaped by the moon's schedule. Twice a day, seawater floods in bringing nutrients and oxygen to the grasses and the creatures that live among them. As the water retreats, it carries organic material back to the sea, feeding plankton and fish far from shore. These marshes are more than just flat stretches of grass. They are living filters, stabilizing coastlines and providing rich feeding grounds for birds and fish alike. Out in the open ocean, tides can trigger even larger spectacles. Some species of coral time their mass spawning events to coincide with specific tidal conditions and phases of the moon. Once a year, for just a few nights, entire reefs release eggs and sperm into the water, all at once, turning the sea into a drifting galaxy of life. The synchronization is so precise that it happens on the same nights, year after year, guided by a combination of water temperature, daylight length, and the subtle cues of the tide. Then there are the legendary runs of the Grunion along the Pacific coast. On certain spring tide nights, these small fish ride the waves ashore, flopping onto the beach to lay their eggs in the wet sand. They time it so that the eggs will hatch 2 weeks later, just as the next high spring tide arrives, to carry the newborn fish back out to sea. It's an intricate plan that only works if the fish, the moon, and the tide are all in agreement and somehow they always are. In Delaware Bay, horseshoe crabs follow a similar script on a larger scale. These ancient creatures, whose ancestors were crawling through shallow seas long before dinosaurs existed, gather by the thousands during the highest tides of late spring. They lay millions of eggs, which in turn become a critical food source for migrating shorebirds. The birds traveling thousands of miles from their wintering grounds to their summer breeding sites time their stopovers to match the crabs spawning. Miss it by a few days, and the birds could go hungry, a reminder that the timing of the tide can ripple far beyond the shoreline. For humans, the intertidal zone has always been a place of opportunity. Ancient fishing communities built stone traps that filled with fish at high tide and held them when the water receded. Some of these traps are still visible today, worn but intact after centuries of use. In some coastal regions, families still gather shellfish at low tide, walking out across the exposed seabed to collect clams, mussels, and oysters before the water returns. And yet, for all its bounty, the intertidal zone is also a place of danger. The same tide that provides food and shelter can also cut off escape routes, stranding the unwary on rocky outcrops or mudflats. That's why people who live by the sea tend to keep one eye on the water and one eye on the tide chart, a habit as natural to them as checking the time. Even inland, far from the coast, the tide's influence can be felt. Migrating birds adjust their feeding and rest cycles to match the moon's phases. Some species of insects time their hatching to the high tides of estuaries, ensuring that their larvae are carried to safe waters. In this way, the moon's pull extends into forest fields and skies, connecting distant places through an invisible thread of timing. It's this connection that fascinates me most. The same force that moves entire oceans can also dictate when a fish lays its eggs, when a bird departs on migration, or when a crab scuttles from its burrow. It's a reminder that gravity doesn't just shape planets and moons, it shapes lives. So, as you picture the tide moving tonight, imagine it not just as water shifting on a beach, but as a pulse running through the veins of the planet. Imagine it touching mangrove roots, lifting salt marsh grasses, nudging fish toward the shore, guiding birds across continents. And above it all, imagine the moon, silent, steady, patient, keeping time for a world that dances to its rhythm, whether we notice or not. The tides may be a global phenomenon, but they speak in local dialects. Each coastline has its own accent, shaped by geography, water depth, and the invisible contours of the seafloor. Some places are dramatic storytellers with tides that surge and roar. Others whisper, shifting the shoreline so subtly you could miss it if you blinked. Let's start with a showstopper, the Bay of Fundy in Canada. We've already mentioned its record-breaking tides, but it's worth lingering here for a moment. Twice a day, the bay fills and empties with more water than all the rivers on Earth combined. When the tide goes out, vast mudflats stretch into the distance, dotted with boats left high and dry. A few hours later, the same boats are floating their ropes taut as the water climbs up the wharf. The change is so fast and so dramatic that visitors are warned not to stray too far onto the flats. The returning tide can sweep in faster than a person can run. Across the Atlantic, on the coast of Normandy, France, the Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel stands as a sentinel over one of Europe's most striking tidal stages. At low tide, the island is surrounded by sand, and you can walk to it across the seabed. At high tide, the sea closes in, transforming it into a fortress surrounded by water. For centuries, this shifting access has protected the abbey from invaders and inspired countless legends. Then there are tidal bores, those rare waves that travel upriver against the current when the tide is strong enough to push inland. The Severn Bore in the UK is one of the most famous drawing surfers who ride the single wave for miles. Imagine gliding past farmland and villages on a river that suddenly decided to reverse course, all because the moon and sun lined up just so. In the Kimberley region of Western Australia, tides create something that looks like an optical illusion, the horizontal falls. Here, seawater squeezes through two narrow gaps in coastal cliffs, rushing so fast that it forms standing waves and turbulent rapids. At peak flow, millions of gallons surge through each gap, driven by a tidal range of up to 10 meters. It's the ocean flexing its muscles in spectacular fashion. On the other end of the spectrum are places like the Mediterranean Sea, where tides are almost an afterthought. The narrow Strait of Gibraltar limits how much tidal energy can enter, so in many harbors, the difference between high and low water is just a few inches. Here you could spend an entire day by the shore and barely notice the tide moving, though if you watch closely, the signs are there in the gentle shift of anchored boats or the exposed rocks along the waterline. The Gulf of Mexico offers another twist. In certain areas, there's only one high tide and one low tide each day, a diurnal pattern that's rare in most of the world. This happens because the basin's shape and position change the way the tidal bulges pass through. It's a reminder that while the moon's pull is the same everywhere, the Earth's surface decides how that pull is expressed. In some places, tides and human life are so intertwined that they become inseparable. Venice, Italy, has its acqua alta, or high water events, when the combination of tides wind and atmospheric pressure floods the city's streets. For centuries, Venetians have adapted with raised walkways, waterproof boots, and a knack for keeping life going, even when the ground floor is underwater. In low-lying island nations like the Maldives, tides play a quieter but no less important role. Here, even a modest rise in sea level can change the way tides behave, flooding land that was once safe and reshaping shorelines. For communities living just a few meters above sea level, the moon's pull is a daily consideration, not just a distant astronomical fact. And sometimes the tides surprise even the people who know them best. In parts of Alaska, extreme low tides can expose stretches of coastline that are usually hidden, revealing ancient footprints preserved in the mud shipwrecks from long ago, or the feeding grounds of whales that venture close to shore. For a few hours, the tide opens a window into another world, and then, just as quickly, it closes it again. These tidal variations are more than curiosities. They're valuable clues for scientists. By studying how tides interact with coastlines, researchers can better understand ocean currents, predict storm surges, and even reconstruct what coastlines looked like thousands of years ago. The patterns of erosion, the buildup of sediment, and the shape of tidal channels all tell a story about the relationship between land and sea. For people living near the coast, these patterns are part of daily life. Fishermen plan their work around them. Harbor pilots know exactly how much water they need under their ship's keels to guide them safely in and out. Even casual beachgoers learn sometimes the hard way that a pleasant stretch of sand can vanish beneath the waves in less time than it takes to finish an ice cream cone. And yet, for all this variety, the tides are united by a single rhythm. No matter how big or small, how fast or slow, they're all connected by the same gravitational conversation between Earth, Moon, and Sun. Standing on a beach in Nova Scotia, you're feeling the same pull that shapes the sand in Normandy, the same cycle that tugs at the mangroves in Thailand, the same pattern that sets the pace for fishing villages in the South Pacific. It's a comforting thought, especially at night when the moon is high and the sea is on the move. Somewhere the water is rushing through a narrow gap, foaming white as it goes. Somewhere else, it's sliding quietly over a rocky shore. And in all those places, life is adjusting, feeding, nesting, traveling to match the moon's steady beat. So as you drift off, picture the world's coasts in all their variety, towering cliffs and flat beaches, bustling ports and empty shores, wild tidal races and gentle ripples. Each one has its own version of the same story told in the language of water and gravity, shaped by the land it meets. And somewhere out there, the moon is still watching over them all, keeping time for this endless, beautiful performance. Every day, twice a day, the tides lift and lower vast quantities of seawater across the planet, trillions of tons in motion, gliding in and out like a breathing world. It's hard to imagine the sheer amount of energy stored in that motion, but humans have been dreaming of ways to use it for centuries. The idea of capturing tidal energy isn't new. Long before anyone talked about renewable power or climate targets, coastal communities understood that the tide could turn more than just seashells. In medieval Europe, tidal mills were already at work. These simple but ingenious systems used incoming tides to fill ponds, and as the water drained out through a channel, it turned a water wheel. That wheel ground grain, sawed wood, or performed other heavy work that would otherwise require far more human muscle. One of the oldest known tidal mills is the Nendrum Monastery Mill in Northern Ireland, built in the 7th century. It was nothing more than stone walls and a wooden wheel, yet it harnessed the moon's pull to keep the monks fed and their community running. There's something humbling about that, knowing that the same gravitational force that holds the moon in orbit also made bread for breakfast. Modern tidal energy works on similar principles, but on a much larger scale. There are 3 main approaches: tidal barrages, tidal stream generators, and tidal lagoons. A tidal barrage is essentially a dam built across a tidal estuary. When the tide comes in, gates allow the water to fill the basin behind the dam. When the tide goes out, the gates are closed and the trapped water is released through turbines, generating electricity. It's a simple concept, but building a structure that can withstand both the ocean's power and the daily change in water level is no small feat. One of the most famous examples is the Rance Tidal Power Station in Brittany, France. Completed in 1966, it still produces enough electricity for over 100,000 homes. The station is so reliable that it has become a kind of silent partner to the surrounding communities. Always there, always steady powered, not by wind or sunlight, but by the ancient rhythm of the moon. Tidal stream generators take a different approach. Instead of blocking the water, they place turbines directly in strong tidal currents. Picture underwater wind, turbines their blades spinning as the tide flows past. Because water is about 800 times denser than air, even a relatively slow current can generate significant power. These devices can be anchored to the seabed or suspended in midwater, and they work in both directions of the tide. Tidal lagoons are a newer idea. These are large, man-made enclosures built along the coast. As the tide rises and falls, water flows in and out through turbines. Lagoons can be built in places where a barrage across an entire estuary wouldn't be practical, and they can double as coastal defenses against storm surges. Of course, the ocean is a challenging work site. Salt water corrodes metal currents, tests every anchor and weld, and storms can undo months of construction in a single night. Maintenance is expensive, and not every coastline has the right conditions for tidal power to be efficient. That's why, despite its promise, tidal energy still makes up only a tiny fraction of the world's electricity supply. There are environmental considerations too. Barrages can change the way sediment flows, affect fish migration, and alter the delicate balance of estuary ecosystems. Even tidal stream turbines, which are less intrusive, must be designed carefully to avoid harming marine life. Engineers work to minimize these impacts, but the trade-offs are real. Still, the appeal of tidal energy is hard to ignore. Unlike wind and solar, we can predict the tides with pinpoint accuracy centuries in advance. The moon's pull doesn't depend on the weather, and there's no such thing as a calm day for gravity. For coastal communities, tidal power offers the promise of steady local electricity power that's as dependable as the turning of the earth. In some parts of the world, small-scale tidal projects are already transforming communities. Remote villages that once relied on costly diesel generators now run on the moon's timetable, their lights and appliances powered by the sea. Research stations in isolated locations use tidal generators to keep equipment running without the need for constant fuel deliveries. It's a fitting partnership, really. The tides have been guiding human life for as long as we've had boats to sail or fish to catch. Now they're beginning to power our homes, our industries, and our future. The moon, in its quiet way, is helping us shift toward a world where our energy comes from the steady, predictable motions of the planet we live on. And perhaps the most poetic thing about tidal energy is that it doesn't consume the resource it uses. The tide will keep flowing in and out whether or not we put a turbine in its path. We're borrowing from a system that has been running for billions of years and will continue long after we're gone. Imagine lying in bed at night, hearing the hum of a tidal turbine somewhere offshore, its blades turning with the water's flow. That sound, if you could hear it through the water, would be the sound of the moon's gravity made useful. It's a kind of music, slow and deep in a key that only the planet knows. So, as you think about the tide tonight, think not only of the water lapping at the shore or the boats rocking in a harbor, but also of the lights glowing in homes powered by that same motion. Think of the invisible connection stretching from the moon across space to the oceans and into the wires that run through our walls. It's a reminder that the forces shaping our world are not just things we observe, they're things we can live alongside, work with, and depend on. Each night, as the moon glows quietly above, something extraordinary is happening across the surface of our planet. It doesn't roar, it doesn't flash, but it moves mountains of water, that is. And this gentle, predictable force is far more than a curiosity or a quirk of nature. It's a fundamental part of how Earth works. The tides are at their heart, a conversation between Earth and the moon, spoken in the language of gravity. The moon pulls, and the oceans lean toward it. It's not a sudden tug, not like yanking on a rope, but more like a constant beckoning. Come here, whispered over billions of years, and the oceans, being polite and perhaps a little sentimental, keep leaning in and then leaning back. This slow rhythm has been going on for as long as there have been oceans to move. It's older than mountains, older than the continents in their current shapes, older than the first creatures that crawled out of the sea, and it's more influential than most of us realize. Tides don't just shift water, they help regulate climate, circulate nutrients, and keep marine ecosystems alive. In a way, you could say the moon is the ocean's personal trainer, making sure it never gets too still, always keeping it in motion. Without tides, large parts of the ocean might stagnate, cutting off the exchange of nutrients and oxygen that so much life depends on. Over time, the deep ocean could grow colder and less hospitable. Currents might weaken, climate patterns could shift. The moon's pull doesn't just make for pretty seaside views, it helps keep the planet livable. The mechanics are elegant. As Earth rotates, the ocean bulges toward the moon and also on the side farthest from it, thanks to the differential pull of gravity. These bulges sweep around the planet, creating high tides where they pass. Between the bulges, water levels drop and low tides appear. The result is a constant planet-wide rocking motion, so gentle you might not notice it standing on the shore, yet so massive it moves entire coastlines twice a day. And here's the clever part, because Earth rotates faster than the moon orbits, those bulges aren't perfectly aligned with the moon. They're slightly ahead, just enough to pull the moon forward in its orbit. This tiny gravitational nudge is what causes the moon to drift slowly away from us, about 3.8 centimeters a year. In return, Earth's rotation slows down ever so slightly, lengthening our days. It's a trade measured in millimeters and milliseconds, but it's been going on for billions of years. Billions of years from now, if nothing else changes, Earth and the moon may end up tidally locked to each other, meaning Earth would always show the same face to the moon, just as the moon already always shows the same face to us. The tides then would be weaker, the moon smaller in the sky, the days longer, but the rhythm would remain. This gravitational interplay has been shaping life for almost as long as life has existed. Many species use the tides as a clock, timing their feeding migration or reproduction to match the rise and fall of the water. From coral reefs releasing their spawn to shorebirds timing their flights, the moon's pull is written into the biological calendars of creatures across the globe. Humans, too, have lived by this rhythm. Before there were printed calendars, people could predict the best times for fishing or traveling along the coast by watching the moon and learning the cycle of the tides. In many places, festivals and rituals were tied to lunar phases, which in turn meant they were tied to the behavior of the sea. The moon wasn't just a light in the night sky. It was a guide, a signal, a presence that touched daily life. Even now, with all our technology, the tide is one of the few natural patterns we can predict with absolute certainty far into the future. We can tell you the exact time and height of a high tide 100 years from now. That reliability is comforting, a steady heartbeat in a world full of noise. And there's something else about tides that I love. They're a reminder that big changes don't always come with drama. The most powerful forces in the world can be quiet, patient, and steady. The moon doesn't rush the ocean. It just keeps asking, and the ocean just keeps answering. Over time, that gentle insistence moves more water than the biggest storm ever could. If you've ever sat on a beach and watched the tide creep in, you know it doesn't announce itself. One moment, your towel is a safe distance from the water. The next, it's in danger of getting soaked. The change is so gradual that you don't notice it happening until suddenly it has. That's the nature of the tide, unhurried, inevitable, and endlessly repeated. As you lie here tonight, think about the tide still moving somewhere even now. In one place, it's uncovering tide pools filled with starfish and sea anemones. In another, it's flooding a salt marsh, bringing fresh nutrients to the grass and the birds that nest there. In the deep ocean, it's stirring layers of water, keeping life thriving far below the surface. And high above the moon is watching over it all, keeping time with a rhythm that began before any of us were here to notice. Tomorrow it will do the same, and the day after that, and for as long as the earth and moon continue their dance. The next time you see the tide, maybe you'll remember this. You're watching a force that connects the smallest shell on the beach to the vast sweep of space, a pull that links your world to another world in an unbroken chain of motion. And you are part of that chain, whether you're standing in the surf, lying in bed, or simply looking up at the night sky. As we come further along this moonlit journey, it's worth stepping back and looking at the tide not just as a natural phenomenon, but as part of a grand ancient conversation. Every tide you've ever seen, every gentle rise over the sand, every quiet retreat is part of a dialogue between Earth and Moon that began billions of years ago and will continue long after we're gone. The beauty of the tide is that it's both constant and ever-changing. The rules are the same everywhere. The moon pulls, the earth rotates, the oceans respond, and yet no two places on earth experience it exactly the same way. Local geography, weather, even the shape of the sea floor, all conspire to give each coastline its own personality. Picture the Bay of Fundy again, that great funnel of water between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Twice a day, the ocean rushes in, climbing so high that entire harbors are transformed. The change is so complete that if you took a photograph at low tide and another at high tide, you might think they were different places altogether. Fishermen here have built their lives around this rhythm, timing their work to the shifting water as naturally as breathing. Travel halfway around the world, and you'll find the opposite mood in the Mediterranean. Here, tides are so modest that they're almost a secret, revealed only in the slight tilt of a boat or the subtle line of salt on a harbor wall. Yet the same physics are at work, the same gravitational pull stretching and releasing the sea. It's proof that the tide is less about the force itself and more about how the earth shapes that force. Then there are places where the tide's personality is dramatic. In the Kimberley region of Western Australia, for instance, the sea pushes through narrow rock gorges so fast that it forms rapids and standing waves, the so-called horizontal falls. The name is misleading. The water isn't falling so much as surging, driven by a tidal range of nearly 10 meters. If the Bay of Fundy is the ocean's deep, steady breath, the Kimberley is its athletic sprint. And sometimes the tide reveals more than just its own power. In certain parts of Alaska, extreme low tides pull back the water to expose the hidden coastline, revealing ancient footprints preserved in mud shipwrecks from centuries past, and feeding grounds where whales glide close to shore. These moments are brief. Within hours, the tide erases its own revelations, sealing them away until the next time conditions are just right. For scientists, these tidal quirks are more than curiosities. They're clues to understanding our planet. By studying how tides interact with different coastlines, researchers can refine models of ocean currents, predict flooding, and even reconstruct past climates. The patterns left by tides in sand and rock are like fingerprints unique to each location, but part of a larger identity shared by the whole planet. For the people who live by the sea, the tide is not just a science lesson, it's a partner, sometimes a challenge and often a source of awe. Coastal farmers flood their fields with seawater at high tide and let it drain away, enriching the soil with minerals. Surfers read the tide like a language, knowing that the best waves often come only when the moon is in just the right phase. Sailors and harbor pilots use tide tables as their silent companions, making sure there's enough water beneath their keels to pass safely. Even those of us who don't live near the shore can feel the tide's influence in subtle ways. Migratory birds adjust their feeding schedules to match the exposure of tidal flats. Certain fish species in rivers and estuaries time their upstream journeys with the tide's push. The moon's pull connects far-flung ecosystems in a way that's both invisible and unbreakable. And for all its variety, the tide remains dependable. In a world where so much feels uncertain, the ocean still keeps its appointments with the moon. Twice a day, the water rises. Twice a day, it falls. You can set your watch by it, and many people do. That dependability is one of the reasons tides hold such fascination. We can predict them centuries in advance, chart their heights and times with precision, and yet they retain a sense of mystery. Standing on a beach as the water creeps forward, you're witnessing a force that links you to every other shoreline in the world, a shared heartbeat of the planet. So tonight, as you settle deeper into the quiet, imagine the moon above its face, pale and familiar, sending its steady invitation across space. Imagine the ocean leaning in to listen, then leaning back over and over in a motion older than memory. Somewhere, a mangrove forest is filling with brackish water. Somewhere else, a salt marsh is draining its grasses, bowing in the retreating flow. And everywhere, life is moving to the moon's rhythm, whether it knows it or not. And maybe tomorrow, if you find yourself near the sea, you'll take a moment to watch the water and think of the vast system at work, the dance of gravity, rotation, and geography that creates the tide. You'll know that what you're seeing isn't just waves on a shore. It's the latest chapter in a story that's been unfolding since the earth was young, and one that will keep going long after we've stopped telling it. If there's one thing the tides teach us, it's that great change doesn't have to happen all at once. The moon doesn't yank the oceans around in a rush. It coaxes them patiently twice a day, every day, for billions of years. And in that patience, it has shaped coastlines, climates, ecosystems, even the length of our days. We've talked about how the moon's gravity pulls the oceans into two bulges, one facing it and one on the far side, and how the Earth's rotation carries different places through these bulges to create high and low tides. We've explored how the sun can amplify or soften this effect, and how geography decides exactly what each coastline will experience. But to truly appreciate the tide, you have to see it not as a two-dimensional rise and fall, but as part of a vast three-dimensional movement of water across the planet. You see the surface tide you notice on a beach is just the visible part. Beneath it, in the deep ocean, there are what scientists call internal tides. These are waves that travel along the boundaries between layers of water with different temperatures and densities. You can't see them from above, but they can be hundreds of feet tall, rolling silently through the depths. Internal tides move slowly, carrying energy far from where they were created, mixing the ocean's layers and keeping nutrients and oxygen moving from the surface to the deep. In many ways, internal tides are the hidden counterpart to the waves we see at the shore. They remind us that the moon's influence reaches into places humans rarely go, the cold, dark expanses, where strange creatures drift and glow, where sunlight never penetrates, and yet the tide still keeps time. This deep mixing is one reason tides are so important for life on Earth. Without it, the ocean's lower layers could become stagnant, locking away nutrients and slowing the cycles that feed marine ecosystems. Plankton, fish, whales all depend on the subtle conveyor belt created in part by the moon's pull. Closer to shore, the tide's energy plays out in more familiar ways. In estuaries, the incoming tide pushes salt water inland, mingling it with fresh river water to create brackish habitats that are home to unique communities of plants and animals. When the tide retreats, it carries organic matter out to sea, feeding the plankton that are the foundation of the ocean's food web. In some places, the tidal range is so large that it transforms the landscape daily. At low tide, vast mudflats appear dotted with burrows and crisscrossed by the tracks of feeding birds. At high tide, those same flats vanish under a shallow sea. It's as if the ocean breathes in and out, revealing and concealing its treasures with each breath. The creatures that live here are perfectly attuned to this schedule. Crabs scuttle out to feed when the tide falls, then retreat into their burrows as the water returns. Shorebirds arrive right on time to hunt in the exposed mud, their long beaks probing for worms and clams. Fish ride the flooding tide into sheltered marshes and mangroves to feed, then slip back out before the water drains away. Even plants feel the tide's rhythm. In salt marshes, grasses grow in zones determined by how often and how deeply they're flooded. Too much salt water and they can't survive. Too little and they're outcompeted by freshwater species. The tide decides who lives where, drawing invisible lines across the landscape. And then there's the human relationship with the tide, as old as coastal living itself. Ancient peoples built fish traps in the intertidal zone, their stone walls still visible in some places today. These traps filled with fish at high tide and held them when the water receded, providing a steady source of food. In some cultures, the tide was seen as a divine force, its predictability a sign of cosmic order. Today, tide charts have replaced observation as our main tool for keeping track, but the connection remains. Sailors, surfers, fishermen, and coastal residents all live with one eye on the moon's schedule. And while technology makes it easy to know exactly when the tide will turn, there's still something satisfying about stepping outside, feeling the air, and knowing without looking whether the water is coming in or going out. One of the most fascinating things about the tide is how it links places that seem utterly different. A high tide in one part of the world corresponds to a low tide somewhere else. The bulges of water created by the moon's pull are always on the move, circling the globe, and in doing so, they connect distant shores in ways we rarely think about. When you stand on a beach and watch the tide change, you're sharing in a planetary event, a movement that's happening everywhere, all at once, in countless unique expressions. It's easy to forget in the middle of our busy human lives that we're part of such a vast and steady system. The moon will rise, whether we notice it or not. The tide will come, in whether we're there to watch or not. And somewhere, as you read this, a fishing boat is adjusting its ropes to match the changing water. A seal is riding the current toward its hunting ground, and a mangrove swamp is filling with the life that arrives on the flood. All of it is connected, all of it is timed, and all of it is powered by the same quiet force that keeps the moon circling us in the sky. So, as you let your thoughts drift tonight, picture the whole earth wrapped in the tide's embrace, the surface waves, the hidden internal tides, the estuaries, the mudflats, the bustling intertidal zones. Think of the moon overhead, patient and unhurried, guiding it all. The tide doesn't ask for our attention, but when we give it, we see the world differently. We see the connections, the patterns, the shared heartbeat of a planet that moves with the pull of another world. And maybe tomorrow, if you're near the sea, you'll pause for a moment and listen, not for the crash of waves, but for the slow, almost imperceptible shift of the tide. The sound of the moon's voice speaking softly to the earth, as it always has, and as it always will. If the moon is the ever-present conductor of the tidal orchestra, then the sun is the guest soloist who steps in at just the right moment to add depth and drama. Together, they produce not just the regular tides we've come to know, but the most spectacular highs and lows, the spring and neap tides that mark the moon's monthly cycle. We've brushed past these before, but now let's lean in and give them their moment in the spotlight. When the sun, moon, and earth line up either during a new moon or a full moon, their gravitational pulls work together. This alignment, known in astronomy as syzygy, a word so delightful you can't help but say it twice creates spring tides. During these events, high tides climb higher than usual and low tides sink lower. The ocean's pulse quickens and coastlines feel the difference. In tidal rivers, the currents during a spring tide can run faster than a strong swimmer. Along beaches, the water may surge farther up the sand, erasing footprints and pulling driftwood into the sea. For those who live near shallow bays, the retreat of a spring tide can feel like the ocean has gone on holiday, leaving boats resting awkwardly on the mud until it returns. Now, if the spring tide is the ocean's big crescendo, the king tide is its encore performance. This happens when a spring tide coincides with the moon being at perigee, its closest point to Earth. The extra gravitational pull amplifies the effect, pushing tides to their extreme. Pair that with the right weather, and you have a recipe for flooding in places that usually remain dry. Cities like Miami, Sydney, and San Francisco track these tides carefully, knowing that king tides can transform streets into canals and test seawalls to their limits. But just as the sun can amplify the moon's work, it can also counteract it. When the sun and moon are at right angles to each other relative to Earth during the first and third quarters of the moon, their gravitational pulls partially cancel out. The result is a neap tide, high tides that are lower than usual, and low tides that are higher than usual. If a spring tide is a symphony's grand finale, a neap tide is a quiet interlude, the ocean taking a gentler breath. These patterns aren't just curiosities for scientists and sailors. They've been guiding human life for millennia. Ancient coastal farmers timed the flooding of their fields to spring tides, letting salt water enrich the soil before it drained away. Fishermen and cultures from Polynesia to Scandinavia have long known which lunar phases would bring the best catches, thanks to the stronger currents of a spring tide or the calmer waters of a neap tide. In some places, entire festivals revolve around these cycles. In Japan, Shiohigari is the tradition of clam digging during the lowest tides of spring, when vast stretches of seabed are exposed. Families venture out with buckets and shovels, gathering shellfish as the sea waits patiently at the horizon. In the Philippines, certain fishing villages celebrate full moon tides with feasts that last until the next morning, the ocean's bounty laid out in thanks for the moon's pull. Spring and neap tides are also critical for navigation. In the age of sail, captains plan their departures and arrivals with these tides in mind, using a spring tide to clear a shallow harbor or a neap tide to ensure gentler docking in a tight channel. Even today, modern shipping schedules can hinge on these ancient rhythms because no amount of engine power can replace the extra depth provided by the moon and sun in agreement. But there's a hidden layer to all of this. Spring and neap tides are not uniform around the globe. Their size and timing depend on local geography, water depth, and the shape of the coastline. In some places, a spring tide might be only a modest increase over the average. In others, it can mean the difference between a safe harbor and a flooded town square. One of the best places to see the drama of spring tides is Mont Saint-Michel in France. At certain times of year, the incoming tide rushes across the surrounding flats as fast as a galloping horse, according to local legend. Within minutes, the island is surrounded and the path to it is submerged. At neap tides, the water's arrival is more leisurely and the sand remains exposed far longer. In the Bay of Fundy, the spring tide can raise water levels by more than 16 meters. The difference between a neap and spring tide here isn't just visible, it's breathtaking. The same harbor can transform from a quiet mudflat to a deep water port in a matter of hours. These cycles remind us that the tide is not a uniform force, but a conversation between celestial mechanics and earthly geography. The moon and sun provide the rhythm, but the earth's surface decides the melody. And there's something profoundly reassuring about that rhythm. You can stand on a shore anywhere in the world and know that right now, somewhere else, the same gravitational forces are at work. You're connected to distant coasts, not by sight or sound, but by the shared pull of the moon and sun. So tonight, as you think of the tide picture, and not just in your own corner of the world, but as part of a vast interconnected system, see the moon in your mind's eye, pulling at the oceans. See the sun adding its weight to the effort or easing it back. See coastlines responding in their own unique ways. A bay flooding here, a reef emerging there, a river reversing its flow under the push of the sea. And remember that these cycles have been running far longer than any of us have been here to watch. They'll keep running unchanged in their fundamentals for millions of years to come. Whether we're sailing by them, fishing by them, or simply falling asleep to the thought of them, the spring and neap tides will continue their ancient dance as reliable as the dawn. If the moon and sun set the rhythm of the tides, then the earth itself decides the choreography. And the stage is far from smooth. It's full of curves, cliffs, narrow straits, and deep trenches. All of these features shape the way the tide moves, giving each coastline its own unique performance. Take the ocean basins, for example. They're not just flat bowls of water. They're vast, irregular containers with ridges, canyons, and underwater mountains. When the tidal bulge, created by the moon and sun, moves across the ocean, it interacts with these features in complex ways. Sometimes the water is funneled into a narrow channel, speeding up and rising higher. Sometimes it's spread thin over a wide area, reducing the tidal range. Resonance is one of the most dramatic ways geography can amplify a tide. Imagine pushing a swing at just the right moment so that each push makes it go higher. That's resonance. In places like the Bay of Fundy, the timing of the incoming tidal wave matches the bay's natural sloshing period so perfectly that the water stacks up, creating the highest tides on Earth. In other regions, the geography works to quiet the tide. The Mediterranean Sea, almost entirely enclosed by land, has only a narrow opening to the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar. This bottleneck limits the amount of tidal energy that can enter, resulting in a range of just a few inches in many places. Here the tide is like a polite guest present but unobtrusive. Then there are the amphidromic point spots in the open ocean, where the tide hardly changes at all. The water around these points moves in a circular pattern, rotating slowly under the influence of the Coriolis effect caused by Earth's rotation. You could sail over one of these points and never know it, yet they're central to the way tidal energy moves through the oceans. Tidal bores are another spectacular result of geography's influence. When a strong incoming tide is forced into a narrowing river mouth, it can create a wave that travels upstream against the current. The Severn Bore in England is famous for this, drawing surfers who ride its single wave for miles inland. The Amazon River has its own version called the Pororoca, a roaring tidal bore that can be heard long before it's seen. The slope of the shore also plays a role in how we experience the tide. On a gently sloping beach, the water may retreat hundreds of feet at low tide, exposing tide pools and sandbars. On a steep, rocky coastline, the same vertical change in water level might only shift the line of wet rock a few meters up or down. Even the deep ocean floor shapes the tide in ways we can't see from above. Underwater ridges can block or redirect tidal waves, while trenches can slow them down. In some cases, tides create internal waves along the boundaries between layers of water with different densities. These internal tides travel silently through the depths hundreds of feet high, carrying energy and nutrients far from where they began. All of these variations remind us that the tide is not a single uniform event, but a system of interconnected movements, each one shaped by the place it's in. The moon and sun may provide the force, but the Earth's features decide how that force is expressed. For the creatures that live along the shore, these local patterns are the difference between life and death. In areas with huge tidal ranges, species must survive long periods of exposure to air and sun. In quieter tidal zones, life can be more predictable, but also more competitive, with less space opening up at low tide. Humans, too, adapt to these differences. In places with large tides, harbors are designed with floating docks that rise and fall with the water. In areas with tidal bores, navigation schedules are built around the arrival of the wave. Coastal farmers in some parts of Asia flood their fields during specific tides to fertilize the soil, while in Northern Europe, mussel farmers use the gentle tides of sheltered bays to cultivate their crops. Even in the age of GPS and satellite forecasts, local knowledge remains essential. Tide tables may tell you when high and low water will occur, but only experience can tell you how a particular bay will behave on a windy day or during an unusually large spring tide. This knowledge is often passed down through generations, a mix of observation, intuition, and respect for the sea's moods. And the moods are many. Sometimes the tide arrives with barely a ripple, slipping in quietly, as if it doesn't want to disturb the shore. Other times, it comes with speed and sound, rushing into estuaries and through narrow inlets, like a river in flood. It can reveal hidden sandbanks or swallow entire beaches. It can leave boats stranded in the mud or lift them effortlessly over shallow bars. Wherever you are in the world, the tide you see is a collaboration between cosmic forces and earthly shapes. It's both a local event and part of a global system, a reminder that we live on a connected planet where every shoreline, no matter how far apart, is linked by the same pull of the moon and sun. So tonight, as you think of the tide, imagine it traveling across the world, rising in one place, falling in another, twisting around islands, funneling through straits, and curling into bays. Picture the moon high above watching as its pull is translated into 1,000 different versions of the same story, each one shaped by the land it meets. And tomorrow, if you stand at the water's edge, remember that what you see is not just the ocean coming and going. It's the latest step in a journey that began far away, influenced by forces you can't see and landscapes you may never visit. It's the world in motion, written in the language of gravity and geography, playing out before your eyes. Some forces in nature are obvious: a lightning strike, a crashing wave, a volcano erupting. The tide, by contrast, is the quiet achiever. It doesn't seek attention. It just keeps showing up twice a day everywhere on Earth, whether we notice or not. And perhaps that's why it's so easy to take for granted. But if you start looking closely, you'll see that tides leave their fingerprints everywhere. In the curve of a sandbar, in the ripple marks pressed into a beach at low tide, in the way salt marsh grass grows in neat horizontal lines. Even in the architecture of coastal towns, you can see evidence of how the tide has shaped daily life for centuries. Walk through an old fishing village, and you might notice the houses are built on stilts or raised stone foundations. That's no accident. It's protection against the highest tides, the ones that arrive without storms to announce them. Look at the harbors, and you'll see floating docks designed to rise and fall with the water, so boats can be tied up at any stage of the tide. In some places, the whole layout of a town follows the tide's rules. Streets might be planned so that key routes remain usable during the highest tides. Markets and ferry schedules are set according to the moon's position, not the clock on the wall. For people here, the tide isn't just a backdrop. It's the metronome that keeps daily life in time. Even inland, far from the coast, tides can have an influence. In large rivers connected to the sea, the tide can push upstream for dozens, even hundreds of miles. Towns along these tidal rivers still feel the moon's pull their water levels, rising and falling on the same schedule as distant harbors. Farmers in these areas sometimes time their irrigation to match the tides using the natural rise to fill their channels. The cultural footprint of tides runs deep. In folklore, the tide is often personified, a spirit, a goddess, or a guardian of the shore. In Maori tradition, for instance, the sea god Tangaroa controls the tides, and his moods dictate whether fishing will be good. In Norse myth, the tide was explained by the giantess Ran, who dragged ships into her underwater hull with a net. And in parts of West Africa, tides were once believed to be the ocean's breath, inhaling and exhaling under the moon's gaze. Tides have inspired art, poetry, and music. They've been metaphors for longing change and the passage of time. Writers use the image of a rising tide to signal inevitability, of a falling tide to suggest loss. Painters have captured the shimmer of wet sand at low tide, the silvered swell of a moonlit high tide. Even composers have tried to mimic the slow, steady rhythm of water advancing and retreating. And then there's the way tides shape memory. Anyone who spent time by the sea remembers the smell of a mud flat on a hot day, the thrill of racing the incoming tide to avoid getting stranded, the sight of a boat resting on its side at low tide and floating again just hours later. These are small, ordinary experiences, and yet they stay with us. For scientists, tides are also a time machine. By studying ancient tidal deposits, layers of sediment left by long vanished shorelines, they can reconstruct what coastlines looked like millions of years ago. The spacing and thickness of these layers can even reveal the length of a day in Earth's distant past, showing how our planet's rotation has slowed over time under the moon's influence. The idea that you can read history in the tide's patterns is humbling. It means that this quiet, predictable force has been keeping records far longer than any human archive. The tide has seen ice ages come and go, continents drift, species rise and fall, and it has kept its rhythm through all of it. There's also something comforting about the thought that the tide connects us, not just to the rest of the world today, but to everyone who has ever lived near the sea. A fisherman in ancient Greece, a sailor in medieval China, a surfer in modern Hawaii, all of them have watched the same rise and fall, guided by the same moon. It's one of the few experiences that's truly universal across time and culture. Whether you live by a bay with gentle tides or on a coast where the water rushes in like a train, you are part of the same global cycle. The exact timing and height may differ, but the pull is the same. So as you settle in tonight, think about the tide not just as a physical movement of water, but as a shared thread running through human history. Think of all the people who have lived by its schedule, relied on its bounty, feared its power, and found beauty in its rhythm. Think of the stories told under moonlight, the songs sung to match its pace, the paintings made to capture its glow. And then picture it happening right now. In some faraway cove, the tide is rising, swirling around rocks. In another, it's falling, leaving wet sand to glisten in the fading light. The moon is overhead, somewhere watching, pulling, guiding. And you, though you might be miles from the water, are still part of its reach. The tide is patient. It doesn't demand our attention with flashes or roars, yet it shapes the world in ways we often only notice when we stop to look. And maybe that's why it makes such a fitting closing chapter for tonight's long journey. It's a reminder that the most constant forces in our lives are often the quietest ones. Every moment, somewhere on Earth, water is on the move. It's slipping into mangrove roots, flooding coral reefs, surging up estuaries, and retreating from mudflats. It's lifting ships gently in harbors and uncovering tide pools where starfish cling to rocks. The moon's invisible hand is behind it all, guiding without pushing, persuading without demanding. If you've ever stood at the water's edge during a calm tide, you know the feeling, that slow, deliberate arrival of the sea, inch by inch, like someone quietly pulling a blanket over the shore. And when it retreats, it's the same, a gentle letting go, leaving behind wet sand and the faint smell of salt in the air. That rhythm is as steady as your own breath. In fact, if you sit by the ocean long enough, you might notice that your breathing falls into sync with it. Inhale as the water comes in, exhale as it drifts away. It's no wonder so many people find the tide soothing. It's like the planet itself is breathing with you. And yet, for all its calm, the tide is also a builder and a sculptor. Over centuries, it shapes shorelines, carves cliffs, and deposits sand in new places. Harbors are deepened, islands are formed, and wetlands are nourished, all by the repeated push and pull of the tide. It's slow work, but relentless. Given enough time, the tide can transform entire landscapes. That's part of what makes it such a powerful metaphor in our stories and songs. The tide can stand for patience, for inevitability, for the way small changes add up to something vast. It can be a reminder that nothing stays still forever, and that change doesn't have to be sudden to be profound. As we've traveled together through this story tonight, we've looked at the tide from every angle, as a scientific phenomenon, a cultural touchstone, a force that shapes life both above and below the waterline. We've seen it at its gentlest and at its most extreme, from the tiny ripples of the Mediterranean to the towering surges of the Bay of Fundy. We've followed it into history, into folklore, into the future of renewable energy. And always at the center of it, there's been that same quiet heartbeat set in motion by the moon and kept steady by the Earth's rotation. It's easy to forget in the rush of daily life that we're part of something so vast and so old. The tide doesn't just happen out there far away. It's part of the same physical laws that keep you grounded, that move the planets, that light the stars. When you think about it that way, even standing barefoot in a puddle, left by the retreating tide, feels like touching the universe. And perhaps that's the most comforting thought of all. The tide connects us, not just to other people across the world who live by it, but to the earth itself and to the moon hanging silently in the night sky. Every time the tide rises or falls, it's the visible sign of a relationship that's been going on for billions of years. So, as we come to the end of tonight's journey, I want you to picture one last scene. The moon is out pale and calm. Somewhere far away, a wave is lapping against a quiet shore. A crab scuttles across the wet sand, leaving a trail that will vanish in minutes. The air smells faintly of salt, and in the background, the tide keeps moving, as it always does, as it always will. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to keep track. The tide will come and go without your help, just as it has for every living thing before you. And when you wake tomorrow, it will still be there, marking the time in its gentle, ancient way. Here on Sleepy Science Nerd, we've let the tide carry us for hours, through facts, through history, through the quiet poetry of the moon's pull. And now it's time to let that same rhythm carry you into sleep. Let your thoughts drift like a boat on a slow rising tide. Feel the pull, the release, the steady motion that asks nothing of you but to follow. Somewhere out there, the next high tide is already on its way. Somewhere else, the water is slipping back toward the sea. And in between those two moments, there's you resting, breathing, part of the same vast cycle, under the same moon, wrapped in the same quiet embrace. Good night, my fellow sleepy explorers. May your dreams be gentle, your thoughts unhurried, and your rest as steady as the tide.